in God, and a lot of people who are suffering discover God or turn to God then, in part because it's a way to live with suffering, to believe in something larger than yourself, to believe that there's some kind of larger reason for the world, that you fit into it in some larger way. And would you talk about that a little bit, why you think that so many people turn to God or find faith at just the moment where you think faith should be falling apart?
Well, that's absolutely true, and I don't want to minimize this at all, because in fact many people who are suffering find great solace in their faith, and many people turn to God precisely when they're suffering, because they generally want to think that there must be some meaning behind this, and they're hopeful that in fact there is meaning behind it. And I don't want to undercut that at all, and I certainly don't want to try and convince people that they should become agnostics the way that I became an agnostic. But for me personally, the fact that somebody finds solace in their suffering by having faith is not, that still doesn't deal for me with the problem, which is why they're suffering in the first place. And I, despite knowing all the answers that people typically give, I simply don't think there is a good answer to it. That if there's a good God who could stop somebody from suffering, why God doesn't do it?
Well, that leads me to another question. Did you ever consider a different religion or a different type of Christianity that wasn't about an interventive God who you communicated with directly and who you petitioned for things through prayer? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I certainly did consider other religions and have thought a lot about other religions. And a lot of religions actually deal with suffering better than in my opinion, the traditional Christianity does. I think it's very hard for me to imagine myself becoming enthusiastic about joining any particular religion, because I think all religions have fundamental problems with them. I have a lot of friends who point out to me that Buddhism, for example, is a religion that handles suffering in a very different way from the way that the Christian religion deals with suffering, and I have no doubt that that's absolutely true. But I think in my head, what I imagine is that there's either a God or there's not a God. And that's just the way I'm kind of hardwired, I think. And my conclusion has been that if there is a God, he certainly is not the God of the Christian tradition, who is all-powerful and over this world and intervening in this world periodically to help people. I think that if there is a God, God is so far beyond anything that we can imagine that we literally cannot imagine him.
Since you spent much of your life as a committed evangelical Christian, as a student, as a professor, I'm wondering, have you found any kind of substitute for providing some of the things that religion once provides you? And that includes answers to certain questions, a way of comprehending your place in the world. I'm sure prayer had a big part in your life, either a meditative
Yes.
kind of prayer or a more conversational or questioning kind of prayer. But what has replaced all of that?
Well, it's an excellent question, because I think that those who argue that everyone should become atheists, as many of our more recent atheist authors have argued, or even people like me who are agnostic and think that agnosticism is better in many ways to organized religion. I think that one needs to put something in the place of what's being taken away. In my case, in part, my Christianity was a way of understanding the world, and I felt very comfortable thinking that I had the solution to life's problems as an evangelical Christian. That became problematic for me because I looked around and realized I didn't seem to have any of the answers to the state of the world. I think today I do what I did as a Christian, which is I continue to seek out what the truth is. I try to understand this world as best I can. One thing that I miss from being in organized religion, of course, is the kind of fellowship that you have with other people who are like-minded. But you can have fellowship with other like-minded people without being religious. And so I think friendships and family are even more important to me than they were before. I think one thing religion provided for me was a sense of what was going to happen in the afterlife. I was very concerned about that. And now I simply don't believe in an afterlife. That was a very disturbing thought for me for a long time, but it's increasingly less of a disturbing thought. There was an ancient philosopher who didn't believe in the afterlife, who said that we weren't upset prior to coming into existence, and we won't be upset after going out of existence. And that so we don't need to worry about it because it's not something that you can control, and it's not something that needs to be a fearsome prospect because we simply won't exist anymore.
You say in your book that there are times when you have doubts and you worry maybe you're wrong, maybe there really is a God. What do you worry about when you have those doubts?
Since when I was an evangelical Christian, of course, I believed that in order to be right with God, you needed to believe in Christ, and if you believed in Christ, you would have a happy life afterwards in heaven. And if you did not believe in Christ, you would roast in hell forever. This was deeply drummed into me and became very much a part of my emotional framework for year after year. So when I first became an agnostic, that was the one thing that really bothered me the most. What if I'm wrong? That's not a happy prospect at all. I've come to think that if there is a God in the world, which I tend to think there's not, but if there is, that surely God is not more cruel than any human being who's ever lived. And there's no human being who's ever lived who has subjected eternal torment on anyone else. And so I simply can't believe that even if there is a God, that one needs to worry about roasting in hell forever. I think that this was a doctrine that was invented by the early Christians, in part in order to convert people, but that in fact it's just a human invention, that it doesn't correspond to anything like a reality.
My guest is Bart Ehrman, author of the new book, God's Problem: How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer. Ehrman is a distinguished professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. How long ago did you stop being a Christian? Did you say, okay, hey, I'm not in the process of thinking about this, I've thought it through, and I'm no longer a Christian?
The event that I remember most clearly was actually I was in a church. Toward the end of my life as a Christian, I had returned to the Episcopal Church, which I liked very much for its liturgy and its worship, since it wasn't based on Christian doctrines, which I had come to doubt, but was based on the worship of God, which I appreciated both personally and aesthetically. But even in the Episcopal Church, they say the creed. And I remember one day in church, one Sunday morning, saying the creed and realizing that in the entire creed, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, etc., that the only thing in the creed that I could any longer say was, he suffered under Pontius Pilate, was dead, and was buried. And that was all I could say, because the rest of it I simply didn't believe. And I think it was at that point that I realized I really needed to stop going to church, because I no longer believed the things that people in church believe, and I felt like I was being dishonest going to church, and that in fact in ways it was kind of a slap in the face of the other people who were there for me to be present with them. And so that's when I stopped going to church, and that was probably 10 or 11 years ago, but I wasn't an agnostic yet. I still believed that there was a God in the world. And I'd say it was maybe 6, 7, or 8 years ago when I finally just admitted, largely because of this problem of suffering that I've been talking about, that I simply didn't believe that there was a God of any sort. So it's not that I'm affirming and absolutely stating there is no God. I don't know if there's a God. But if there is a God, he certainly is not the God that I grew up to worship in the Christian tradition.